welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Language Teachers Forum, which is a joint initiative between the Modern Language Teachers Association of Queensland and Griffith University. Sorry that we're not in our regular meeting room that we couldn't get today, but hopefully this will be just as good. It's nice to see everybody here. We have some people go to meeting, joining virtually as well, and we're being filmed so that people from other parts of Queensland will be able to join in at a later time. It's good to see people come so far. Margaret's come down from Toowoomba again today, and Kadawaki Sensei has been a regular visitor she's from Osaka, but she's at the University of Queensland, but this will be her last Language Teachers Forum, and she's going back in August. But yeah, it's great to see everybody here. Thanks very much, Michael, for coming. Michael was my previous boss when he was at Griffith. So yeah, we're all really looking forward to finding out more about socioeconomics of languages. So thanks.
It's in Japan. Okay, so this particular topic, socioeconomics of languages, I'm speaking about this because I actually haven't been teaching language itself for a while now, so I don't think I'm in a good position to be preaching to people about language teaching. In fact, I'd learn a lot more from all of you, I think. But the reason I wanted to bring up this topic is I guess we know that languages, there's not as many people studying languages as we would like, whether it's in high school or in university, trying to bring it into primary school. Not enough people are doing it. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here. So I'm not trying to convince you of that, right? Because you're already convinced. However, one of the problems we seem to have when we talk about languages, whether it's in schools or universities, it's constantly talked about in terms of some kind of crisis, yes? And the discourse around languages has been pretty negative, I would say, for at least 20 or 30 years, if you look back in the sort of history of language policy. There was a sort of flourishing, I think, in the 80s with Joe Lo Bianco and this kind of sense of hope for a national language policy, and things were turning around. And there was a bit of a boom, I think, at that time. I was part of the boom. I started studying Japanese in 1991, so I was in the middle of that boom, right, when everyone rushed off and started learning Japanese and so on. But things have sort of trickled down, and there's this sort of ongoing sense of crisis and so on. And so what I really want to do today is to try to shift the discourse around, actually. And I have to acknowledge this has been something I've been thinking about for a long time, but I think Alfredo Martinez down in Melbourne put it really nicely, that the language teaching profession has been talking about crisis for so long, perhaps it's time to turn the discourse around to something a bit more positive. And I think the positives are that languages are actually a very important part of the socio-economic fabric of the country, and what I want to talk about today is why that's going to be increasingly so. This is something that's not going away, for sure. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Okay, that's my motivation. Of course, we're battling this kind of mentality, right? That everyone in the world speaks English, you can just get away with English all around. And look, this comes through all the time. My heart sank. I was in Canberra for some event, and the director of the National Film and Sound Archive said these words: "Oh, languages are easy in Australia, it's just English." I mean, my heart sank. This is the director of the National Film and Sound Archive who has the idea that the only language that matters in Australia is English. So, you know, we've got a long way to go with attitudes around English. So, of course, this is a nice little clip to sort of get us warmed up.
Please tell me you speak English. I'm Detective Carter. Do you speak any English? Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? I cannot believe this shit.
谢谢。
First I get a bullshit assignment, now Mr. Rice-A-Roni don't even speak American.
Okay. And then there's, of course, a follow-up to what happens.
All of a sudden you speaking English now, huh?
A little.
A little my ass, you lied to me.
I didn't say I didn't. You assume I didn't.
Assume I kick your little Beijing ass right now, man. I ain't scared of you. I know you know that little tricky shit. Come on.
I'm not responsible for your assumption.
You full of shit. You understand that? You full of shit.
Not being able to speak is not the same as not speaking. You seem as if you like to talk. I like to let people talk who like to talk. It makes it easier to find out how full of shit they are.
What the hell
Okay,
did you
so
just say?
I'm sure you enjoyed all the bad language there. So we're kind of dealing with that. I mean, that's kind of a popular perception, but it's not just limited to stupid Hollywood films with Jackie Chan in them. These are serious scholars. Benjamin Herskovich down in the Center for Independent Studies. That's a kind of private sort of think tank, I suppose. You might, I don't know if it's right or left wing. Well, it's not left wing, but it's sort of an economic think tank, basically. And he was talking, this is the title of his report, Australia's Asia Literacy Non-Problem. So this was at the time they were introducing or coming to the end of the national language, kind of Asian languages program, and whether we should be reviving it and so on. And his response, his set of arguments were that English is the preeminent world language. English is an Asian language. I thought that was an interesting argument. Australia already speaks the languages of Asia, and Asian cultural literacy is being acquired through osmosis. So apparently you go down to Sunnybank, order some spring rolls, and somehow you're fluent in all sorts of cultures of the world. This is serious work, right? So the arguments are being put that we don't really need to learn languages. Okay, so I really want to sort of counter that view, and what I'm trying to provide here today, and I'll make the slides available, is reasons that we can bring to people when there's an opportunity to say, well, why is that view, which seems kind of quite intuitive, right? Especially to people who are well-to-do. They travel around the world, you check into hotels, everywhere you can use English. And you go to academic conferences, that's the worst. Everyone seems to speak English at the conference. Doesn't matter which part of the world they're from. So you start to get the sense that everyone in the world is speaking English. But of course, this isn't quite the reality, as you'd know. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the sort of broader context, languages around the world, then the Australian language habitat, which is something that lots of Australians don't actually know a lot about. Then talk briefly about second language policy and what the real practices have been in Australia. And then the sort of guts of what I wanted to say is this changing socioeconomic landscape. So things are rapidly changing in the way in which economies are working, and that has big implications for languages education, and then finally some implications there. Okay, so as you'd well know, there's a lot of languages spoken around the world. I mean, it's worth remembering that. English is just one of them. And not only that, in most nations around the world, they're multilingual, right? They're not unilingual, monolingual kind of countries. There's more than 7,000 languages spoken around the world. Nearly 2,500 of them are endangered. Quite a few of them in Australia, but not only in Australia, in the Amazon and South America and other places as well. Interestingly, not surprisingly, as we'd know, 23 languages really dominate, and they're spoken by over half of the world's population. And this is a really telling figure. 40% of people have no access to education in a language they actually understand. So that's quite a sobering figure of what's going on around the world in language. So language, in a very real sense, is about access to opportunity and education. So we can sort of look at these figures. As well known, the language with the most first or native or whatever mother tongue speakers is Mandarin Chinese, and then Spanish and English in third place. But when we add in the sort of second language or additional language speakers, then the figure goes over 1 billion. It could be 2 billion. It's very hard to get a handle on these sort of figures because they're basically just taken from a census, and it's a guesstimate, basically. We don't really know. It's just sort of some kind of best guess figure for these numbers. But you can see that there's a certain, these would be the languages which are dominating around the world. So one of the first reasons why, I mean, that's one thing. You would see that there's an awful lot of speakers of other languages besides English, right? So that's something to bear in mind. The second is not everything goes through English. So we can get the sense in English speaking, where English is a predominant language, as it is in Australia, that everything's going through English, but it actually isn't. So if we look at what's going on in terms of book translations, it's quite interesting. So you can see that English, of course, is one of the key centres through which, through mediators of translations, right? So obviously if things are getting translated in or out of English, that's one thing. But it's also used as a mediating language between distant languages, which there aren't necessarily translators who know, say, Polish and Irish or something, I don't know. Two languages where there's sort of languages where there's less speakers, and you have to get a sort of specific skill set to be able to translate between those two. So often they use mediating languages in those sorts of situations. But what we see is that English is one of them, but Spanish is another, French is another, Dutch is another, Chinese is another, Russian is another, and there's lots and lots of different centres of these sort of mediating languages for translation of books, which is of course a big part of the education system. So that's part of that global language network. Wikipedia is interesting, of course, because it's set up originally in the English-speaking world. It, of course, predominates. But again, while it's a central node, you start seeing these distance nodes, right? So you start from English and you go through here, through to through to Russian, through to other languages as well. So what I'm saying is it's not that every language in the world connects into English all the time. It doesn't. And the same for the Twitter sphere, which is interesting as well. So they were mapping where things are going in the Twitter sphere as well. This was a big study in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and showing how it goes through different languages as well. So again, it's the same point. English is part of this global language sphere, but it's not necessarily the centre, and it's not the only centre by any means. And this is interesting work recently being done by Joe Lobianco, who's a big figure, I think, in Australian language policy and so on in Australia. And he got himself a paper published in Nature, which if you're in the academic university world, that's like the best thing that you can get published in, basically. That they might even give you a car park or something if you manage to get published in Nature. But it's certainly seen as really prestigious. And he was bringing up the issue of how important language is today in terms of resolving conflict, particularly in multi-ethnic societies. So which language you speak, what is the language of government, how many languages there are. These are all flashpoints, right? And not necessarily easily resolved. And he goes on to say that it's no exaggeration to say that among the most pressing social concerns of the world today are questions of intercultural understanding and civil coexistence. Every effort possible should be invested in mutual understanding, conflict resolution, and consensus building. So I guess what he's trying to get at is if people are running around blowing each other up and fighting and engaging in wars, it doesn't matter how many vaccines and so on that we produce, we're still in trouble, right? So it's trying to shift languages to being a central and important part of what's going on in the world, which it is, right? Again, it's something we understand, but it's being able to convey that to the wider world, I think, is really quite important. So this is the recent Salzburg Statement for a Multilingual World, which came out last year in December. In today's interconnected world, the ability to speak multiple languages and communicate across linguistic divides is a critical skill. Even partial knowledge of more than one language is beneficial. Proficiency in additional languages is a new kind of global literacy. language learning needs to be expanded for all, young and old. So this is basically a group of some of the most preeminent scholars around the world coming together, making this statement that it's not going backwards. The world that we're living in, the sort of interconnected world we're living in, means we really need to be upping our game in terms of language learning. So the imperative there is certainly there on the world stage. What about Australia itself? What about the comment that there's only English in Australia, so it doesn't really matter? Okay, first thing to note, Australia doesn't have an official language, although obviously English is the de facto national language. It's really interesting. It's spoken at home by about 73% of people in Australia, so 17 million or so. That's a really interesting figure, because what it means is there's another, well, the census obviously is having trouble matching. I know the two percentages don't match up. There's a bit between, which is not quite sure. Are they speaking English or probably what's happening is they're speaking a mixture, right? So I remember when I filled in the census, I didn't know quite what to do, because I speak in English and my wife speaks in Chinese, right? So what are we speaking in? Both, well, mixture, right? So in any case, there's certainly 22% of Australians speaking another language at home. That's a really large figure, right? And it's something that sort of seems to escape attention a lot of the time when we're talking about languages education. And it's worth mentioning Australian Indigenous languages. They're spoken by 0.3% of the population. That, of course, reflects partly the small number of Indigenous Australians as well as a percentage. But just down to 65,000 people, so that's a really small number. Although there's only a small number of speakers of Indigenous languages, there's a lot of them, right? And that's a really important part of the Australian language habitat. So this is a sort of, this is a famous map. It was produced in 1996. So it may be that linguists will continue to debate the exact boundaries and so on. But what it's trying to represent is all the different areas here representing all the different Indigenous groups and the languages that went with them at the time pre-contact, before other folk arrived in Australia. And at the time of contact, if I use that more neutral term, there were about 300 languages being spoken in Australia at that time. And now there's about 18 which are healthy. Of those other 280, some of them are just gone. Some of them they're trying to revive. But this is the work of linguists out in the outback. There's a number in our school who go out into the field. I always think it's very romantic. They assure me that it is not. It's just hard work. I always wonder what they eat out there. Apparently there are some shops around. But anyway, so they're out there trying to document these languages and trying to bring the languages back to the people. And of course, the reason that I say socio-economic, right, with languages, of course, because we know that there's an awful lot of social issues associated with Indigenous Australia in terms of health, in terms of issues of crime, in terms of education, educational outcomes, and so on. We can certainly debate it, of course, but what you could say is that one part of that missing puzzle is language, right? In very simple terms, if you've lost your language, you've lost the insight into your culture, and it's hard to see how you can feel whole as a person, basically. And then this is the problem that's striking people. So work in trying to revive Indigenous languages, you'll certainly see elders and communities talking about having that return back to them and reviving their culture and their lives and feeling whole again as a person. So this is part of the reconciliation process, right? If people can't be speaking their own ancestral language, I don't think there can really be reconciliation. It's a key part of it. And with reconciliation, we hope becomes a gradual change, social change as well. There's also migrant or community languages, depending on how, every term is loaded, right? Once you start thinking like a language person, right? Do I call it a migrant language? It skews it in one direction. I call it a community language. It skews it in another direction, right? So I'll call them both. And of course, these come in waves, they come up and down, and sociolinguists have been studying these things over the last 50 to 60 years. At the moment, Mandarin Chinese would be the most predominant one. It's fairly obvious. But also large communities of Arabic speakers, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and then I guess what are seen as the more traditional ones, at least in the Victorian Melbourne area, such as Italian and Greek, and so on. So there's quite a range of community languages, and there's quite a large number of speakers. And what's interesting about the migrant community languages area is a lot of communities, I must admit I don't know the level of government support there is, but my understanding is most of this kind of migrant community language education is organised by those communities, basically. Yeah? So that's certainly what's done in the Chinese-speaking community, I know, in the Japanese-speaking community as well. So there's not a lot of government support. Very interesting. I'll say something controversial again. I remember raising this with a member of the Department of Education in Queensland and said, why aren't we teaching people who already speak Chinese to write? Because they already speak, right? Why don't we just teach them to write? And his response was basically that they're a problem and they're putting everyone off, and so there was no answer. It was, we don't deal with them, basically. They're a problem, and they're not as good at speaking Chinese as they think they are. So, okay, so we give up. Okay, so there seems to be a bit of an issue. How do we handle migrant community languages? How do we make use of this resource? Of course, it's loaded, right? So I completely understand when you have heritage kids come into a Chinese classroom or a Japanese classroom and they're competing with the sort of ab initio kids, then that's not exactly fair, right? Because how can you compare grades if you've got a background? That doesn't seem fair. But surely we can start coming up with solutions. Anyway, that's another area. I always think this is a work by Gerhard Leitner. He's a German scholar, but he had has great interest in Australian English. And he published this 2-volume book, which is quite, well, I wouldn't call it bedtime reading or anything, but it's certainly an interesting volume. And I think the most interesting idea that he had in this volume was this idea of language habitat and how it was originally inhabited by a range of indigenous languages, and then you have a sort of invading language, which is originally English, plus a set of other languages, and how these languages mix together. And what we get is a very complex language habitat in Australia now, ranging from our indigenous languages, various ethnolects of Australian English, which are recognisable, I suppose, your so-called mainstream Australian English, and then languages other than English, all the migrant community languages. So there's an awful lot going on in Australia, much more than the ordinary folk might think. So Australia has a really complex and diverse linguistic landscape, and this point's repeatedly noted by many prominent Australian linguists. And that rich linguistic landscape is largely untapped socioeconomic resource. In Australia, we're really good at digging stuff up out of the ground. But for some reason, we don't seem to be able to make the best of what we have in the people around us. It's very interesting, right? Oh, I guess it's more simple to dig things out of the ground. I'm sure a mining engineer, I've got to be careful it's being recorded, will protest that there's many complexities, and I acknowledge there are. However, the resources are there, right? And for some reason, we're not taking advantage of them. And that's certainly not an original idea. That's something that a very prominent linguist, Michael Klein, he made that point many, many times, that we have this resource and we just don't make anything of it. And it hasn't changed. The resource, in fact, it's becoming richer and richer, you might say, and yet we keep sort of squandering it for some unknown reason. And I guess what you would say the problem is this policy and practice link. This is the thing that's really been difficult for us to work out in Australia. Okay, so this is Joe Bianco in a recent volume looking at language policy, and he's giving a summary of what's happening in Australia. And this, of course, is a person who came up with the statement of a national language policy in 1987. And there was a sort of flurry of excitement and activity, but in the end, it didn't seem to coalesce. And so he states, the absence of a national language policy contributes to a weak language policy environment, where language rights are highly politicized, and the loss of a collaborative language policy processes has led to fragmented and fragile language program provision. So it's a pretty good summary of what's going on, right? Probably there's people in the room who know much better than me, but it's all split across states, right? So language provisions is spread across states. There is some kind of national curriculum at the high school level, but it is split across the provision. We have different programs going on. The different programs don't speak to each other. The different education sectors are not really speaking to each other. What does TAFE do? What does the university do? What's the primary schools, what are the high schools doing? What is everyone doing together? And within the school sector, there's independent schools, there's Catholic schools, there's state schools. It's really hard to find anything out. Even if you want to know how many students study languages, it's really hard to find this kind of information out. It's surprising, right? It's a lot of work. I was trying to figure it out again today. And you assemble this bit and this bit and this bit, because I was just interested to see if I could come up with a different figure that I've read. But it's actually very difficult to find this information because it's so fragmented. And this kind of fragmentation seems to go through this sort of political cycle. And the political cycle is this sort of crisis, and we've got to do something about it. There's some kind of policy or program set up, and then I guess because of the political cycle, they either get voted out or they get bored of it because it's not creating news, and so the program ends, and then it just goes off a cliff. So even if something's set up, then eventually it just goes off the policy cliff. And this is a problem of it being sort of politicized, basically. So this is a good example. Geo8, they're the self-proclaimed universities who think they're part of some exclusive club. Yeah. No comment. Basically, this group here decided so this was really high level. The VCs, the vice chancellors, who are basically the CEO of the great university industry, they all got together and decided there was a crisis and they better do something about it. And these kind of figures really get people's attention. In the 1960s, 40% of people were graduating with a language, and now it's only 13%. That was in 2007. So there's obviously a really big drop. Of course, who goes to high school and who goes to university and so on has completely changed in that period of time, right? But nevertheless, the figure is really quite striking. I mean, the obvious reason why that happened, of course, is because if you ask, this is people who have been in the university a longer time than me, tell me in the old days, universities, when you went into, say, a Bachelor of Arts, language was compulsory part of the Bachelor of Arts. It certainly wasn't when I started my BA. But you can imagine if everyone in the BA had to do a language, well, that would mean more would do it in high school and so on. So I think the universities acknowledge that students not doing language is actually partly the way in which the university themselves have been organising things. So they came up with this policy. They would give people a bonus in their OP or ATAR and so on. 10 years later, I think the figure for the number of students studying in year 12 around the country is 13 or 14%. So it's made absolutely no difference at all. However, they did get to tick a box, I suppose. And I'm not meaning that it wasn't sincere or well-intentioned, but these are difficult things to change. And you can see in the sort of policy documents as well, this is the Australian Department of Education and Training. These are the 8 key learning areas. So you have, your English and STEM, which we hear an awful lot about at the moment. But also languages is one of the 8 key learning areas. If you've only got 12 or 13% of students doing it doesn't sound very key to me. Then you have intercultural understanding as listed as one of the 7 general capabilities. How is it that you develop intercultural understanding? Well, I suppose, you know, the best way is learning a language, right? So again, 13% of students in Year 12 doesn't really sound like it's a general capability. It sounds like a fairly specific one, actually. And then again, we have the sustainability, Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' histories and cultures. So these are 3 kind of cross-curriculum. So I suppose the one that would be relevant, of course, to languages is Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia. I'm going to sound really cynical, but I suppose if English is the Asian language, well, it doesn't really matter, right? But I know you don't believe that, and we know that's not true. Okay. There's also the Queensland Department of Education, which is spruiking the importance of languages. So it's really interesting. There's really high-level support for this, right? You've got groups of vice-chancellors in self-proclaimed universities. You've got the National Department of Education and Training. You've got the Queensland Department of Education saying, you know, what we're trying to do, we're trying to help our students to become global citizens by building their confidence to interact with other cultures and communicate in other languages. So it's there, right in the centre of it. 10, 12%, right? So we're just not getting there. It's an interesting. So what you could say is there's a real gap. There's a real gap between policy and continuous policy, both national policy and state policy, which emphasises again and again and again the importance of learning languages, and what actually happens on the ground, which is our 11% or so. This is in 2014. So remember the 13% we saw in 2007? It had dropped back to 11% by 2014. So I thought I'd have a look at numbers, because it's always interesting just to look at numbers. This was from 2017. I was trying to get a sense of, oh, okay, who's actually studying languages? And I had a look at 2007, but I thought we wouldn't get too much into this kind of number stuff. But you can see some of the key languages, as you'd expect. You've got Chinese and French, German, Japanese is a big one. Spanish, looking back, seems to be increasing in number. Indonesian and Korean are both dropping, and say German and Italian are probably dropping a bit as well. And the others, Chinese seems to be going up a bit, French seems to be holding steady, Japanese seems to be dropping slightly. So there's sort of all sorts of ups and downs. But I think the overall figure is pretty much the same. There were 4,814 students enrolled in languages in 2017. And 36,800 doing English. I mean, I couldn't find out what are the total number of students in Year 12, but I thought the number of students doing English was getting pretty close, because most students have to do English for the most part, right?
English or English communication?
Yeah.
Some variation.
Yeah, so there'd be it'll be, it's like I said, I mean, I would have thought they would just have like a total at the bottom of the table, but they didn't. So it's lurking, if we do that as a percentage of that, it's something like 13%. I don't know if it's counting people twice, maybe some students do more than one language. So it's not clear what is the actual percentage of students doing these languages. But it's lurking around 11, 12, 13%, something like that. So it's sitting exactly at the same place. So, there's been repeated assertions of the importance of studying second languages in Australia, and yet the study of second languages in Australian schools and universities is either flatlined or it's sort of even in decline in some places. And actually, looking at the figures, I think that the decline's probably worse in the universities than it is in the schools. If I look at the schools, it just seems to have flatlined. In universities, I think it's actually in decline, is what's going on. So that doesn't bode well for schools, because if less students do it at university, then slowly less will do it at school. Okay. Now, I want to argue that's exactly the wrong thing to be happening. And there's really important reasons why it is. The socioeconomic landscape in the world is really changing. So one thing that's changing, so this is something you can take back to your bosses. I think this is really important information. The first thing is it's what's called the new globalization. and that's to do with trade and services. And the second thing is to do with developments in machine translation. So these are two things which are really shaking everything up. Now, a very crass person would think, I just grab my iPhone or whatever up, and I go in. Have you got the app, the iTranslate and Google Translate app on your phone? You should get it. It's really fun because you speak into it. It's not bad. You speak into it, and you can come up with all sorts of languages, right? So I won't do it now, but you can basically speak into it, and reasonably simple sentences. It seems to pick it up. I was trying last night again, and even with a stuffy nose, it seemed to be able to understand me most of the time. And it picks up speech recognition, right? So you speak into it. If you're traveling around, you can go, "Where's the toilet?" And it'll come out in whatever language you want. Okay. So we're done, right? We're done. We can just shut up shop and we're done. No. Well, what's happened is, what I want to argue is exactly the opposite. It's kind of like you've given everyone in the world the calculator, right? It's the sort of revolution they had in maths. Before the calculator, I hazard a guess that only the really, really smart kids went on with maths because it was really complicated, right? But as soon as you had the calculator, suddenly it's something everyone has to do because the basic sort of calculations can be done for you. So it's a little bit like that with language, right? Suddenly we have this sort of tool in our hands. Everyone's got it. Everyone's got to know how to use it. It's different, right? In the past, if you just spoke English or just spoke Chinese or just spoke Japanese, and you didn't have access to this, you can just stay in your bubble, right? But now you can start using this kind of stuff to communicate with other people. You really have to know what it is you're doing. So everyone has to understand how languages work, not just a select few. So I guess it's sort of the opposite of what people think, these two things. So I'll go into a bit more detail as to what I mean. Okay, so the new globalization. This is by an economist. I've read it over the summer because, you know, that's just what you do. You read a book by an economist over the summer. My brother pointed it to me. He's a senior economist in the OECD, and he thought it was rather interesting. So I read it. I confess I didn't read the whole book because it is economics, but I did what everyone normally does when they don't want to read the whole thing, but they want to get the right idea. They read the introduction and the conclusion chapter, right? Because that's where the most important bits are. So if you want to grab it from the library or whatever, I encourage you to read the introduction and the conclusion. If you're really into economics, read the middle as well. Okay, but basically what Richard Baldwin is talking about, and he's a world-leading economist, and he's the sort of economist that people at the OECD listen to. The OECD is an international organization which provides economic advice to the leading developed countries around the world. Of course, it's a funny process, my brother tells me, because they hand on economic advice to politicians who then go, oh, no, we think mining's on the upswing. And then so they sometimes have to negotiate the advice a little bit. But nevertheless, they are serious economists and they know what it is they're doing, even if they can't always deliver exactly the report they'd like to. Okay, and what this economist is talking about is just the way in which trade and globalization how things have changed essentially over the last 150 years. So essentially at the beginning, before we had globalization and trade, most of us were just peasants, and we used to work out in the countryside, and there were some lords who lorded it over us, who extracted their taxes out of us, right? That's pretty much how it worked, more or less, in a lot of societies, not every society, of course. So the idea was you grew your food, you made your things, and you used what it is you produced. Of course, because at that time, the first barrier to trading was, of course, distance. You couldn't move things around. So the first revolution in terms of trade was being able to move things around. And of course we know that happened with shipping and so on, right? And things have become more and more easy to move around. So now we get asparagus from Mexico and Peru, we get raspberries from France. I mean, we get bread that's made in Ireland. I'm talking about in Coles, right? It comes from all over. Have a look at where everything comes from. It comes from a long way away. So the first breakdown was sort of the movement, the cost of moving stuff around, the cost of trade. So that really reduced. So that was the first step towards this kind of globalized world. The more recent one, and that happened over a period, I don't know, from the 1600s onwards, I suppose, right? And of course that shook up and changed all sorts of societies around the world, and we'll leave that to the historians to debate and argue about the effects of that. More recently, of course, is this ICT revolution, right? I always remember, I always think of my time starting at university as at the beginning of it, because when I first started at university, we had to line up to enroll. Yeah? I think most of us had to do this. And you lined up, and at the end of a long 2-hour line or whatever it was, you got to meet someone who actually looked at what you were going to study and said, yeah, no, that's not a good idea, or maybe you should do this or that, right? But while I was at university, it changed, and it changed to doing it electronically. And I think in my 3rd, 4th year, they brought in email. You have to remember there was this pre-email time, right? And I guess what you would reflect on is, at that time, everything moved a lot more slowly. So this is for the academic people. When you used to write an article to send to a journal, you used to make 3 hard copies of it. You'd put it in a post, and it'd go off around the world. And then 6, 9 months later, maybe 1 year later, you get a letter coming back, and they'd give you some advice about it. So everything moves really slowly. Now I'm involved in editing a journal. If people don't see it's under review within a week, they get a bit concerned. So we're really moving a lot faster, right? So the ICT revolution basically means you can just work with people all around the world in ways that you just really couldn't before. So it has changed things a lot. So the cost of communication has come down, and it reminds me of when I was really young and talking to my grandmother on the phone. In those days it was tolls, right? And so she didn't want to speak for very long because I think it was really expensive, yeah? To talk. This was like national calls between different towns and stuff. It was really expensive to make a toll call, so you had to speak really quickly and you didn't muck around, right? Now, what do? Even when we're on the blimmin' plane, we can still be WhatsApping each other and so on. So we really don't disconnect at all. It's much quicker. So communication has really changed. And because communications have changed, that's changed the way in which people do business, basically. And it's been, what would you call it, like it's essentially sped it up, as it were. So international trade has just got faster and faster and faster, and it's enabled more complex change in supply chains. So like Coles supermarkets, right? Where they source goods from all around the world, and it ends up in Toowong or in Carindale or wherever it is, right? In the supermarket there, from all around the world. So this is the communication cost. The last thing, but in this kind of trade environment we've had, most of the trade has actually been in goods, right? So we move stuff around. We make things and we move them around. So a lot of trade is in that. The thing that's starting to change is, up until now, face-to-face costs are still expensive, right? You have to get in a plane, you have to go somewhere. I mean, international travel is a lot cheaper than it used to be, but it's still expensive. It costs time, right? If you want to go all the way to the UK, you have to sit in the plane for 24 hours, and there's waiting time at the airport and stuff. It's a 30-hour trip, 30 hours just to get there to do something. So that's a fairly high sort of face-to-face cost. If you want to do some face-to-face business, then the cost is high. However, things are changing in that world as well. So one of the things that's changing quite quickly is telepresence. So you would have noticed when you're speaking with people on FaceTime and so on, even if it's international, you don't get a time lag anymore. Remember you used to have to speak and then there was a lag, and then so you'd have these weird conversations because they hadn't quite heard what you'd said, and there'd be lots of repair going on when you're talking. Now that's a lot less common, right? Unless you've got a crappy connection. It's as if they're in the same room. However, that's still not enough. If you want to do really high-level stuff, you really need to feel the person, right? Because when we're trying to negotiate something with someone, we're looking for really subtle clues, yeah? Like really subtle. As in, just even a bit of in-breathing can mean something. So what do you think of this deal? It means something. You breathed, right? So the point being, as this telepresence technology gets better and better, it gets to the point where actually you don't have to be in the same room anymore. We're not there yet, but it's rapidly getting there quicker and quicker and quicker, right? We don't actually have to be in the same room anymore to do really high-level work. The second thing is, with this kind of technology, it means it's called Tele Robotics. So, of course, they're talking a lot about automation, right? But the big money in automation, I mean, they've had automation since, you know, the Industrial Revolution, so that's not new. But what they're talking about is sort of really high-level automation, right? And the use of robots and so on to do work. Someone has to fix the robots and look after them. Someone has to control the robots, right? At some point, you have to have some engineer or someone who knows what it is. They don't just kind of pop up like daisies and do their thing, right? So someone has to actually be managing these robots. So telerobotics means that people remotely can start manipulating and using these robots to do work in other countries. Okay, so what this means is suddenly something that has really been the preserve of nation states, which is professional services, can be sold and traded overseas. Yeah? So if you have a really high-level surgeon who's using telerobotics to conduct surgery, what's to stop them selling their services from the US to Australia if you want the best surgeon? What's to stop them? Yeah. The only thing that would stop them, of course, is political boundaries, right? But trade has a way of breaking through these kind of boundaries because in the end, people want the best services, right, if they can afford them. So essentially, what we're looking into, and this is quite a big disruption, is disruption in services, which, as I said, have been mostly nationalised. We're facing something quite different in the world. I think it's gone to sleep. Oh. Okay, I'll just use this one. Okay, so this is a quote from this guy Baldwin. So for service sectors, the impact is likely to be revolutionary. So many service sectors were only indirectly affected by the first and second unbundling, so that was the trade costs and communication costs, since they sold services that were essentially untradeable. So the heart of the untradability was the necessity for the service providers and the service buyers to be physically in the same place at the same time. But really cheap, reliable, and ubiquitous virtual presence technology and telerobotics will break this necessity. In short, the third unbundling could do to the services sector what the second unbundling already did to the manufacturing sector. So that's actually quite a, well, I would say that's quite a sobering thing, right? Because we know what happened to the manufacturing sector, yeah? This is all to do with Trump and America. Essentially, Trump's been elected to somehow reverse the clock and bring back the jobs in the manufacturing sector. Well, it ain't gonna happen. And even worse is that in the meantime, jobs in the services sector could start being traded, right? And if they start being traded, they can move around. They're not nationalised anymore in the same way. So it's a big, big political thing. Okay, just to give a sense of it, services in the Australian economy. We always think of the Australian economy as mining, of course, because Australia has done very well out of it, and it's a rich country because of mining. But actually, the guts of the Australian economy is mostly in services. So 79% of jobs are in services. So nearly 80% of jobs are in services. 72% of the output that we produce is from services, and of the total GDP, about 61% of it is from services. The differences there, of course, means mining and so on are worth a lot more to the economy than they are in terms of money than they are in jobs, yeah? Things like that. But that's an awful lot of people, yeah? 80% of people.
All of us, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Education is a tradable service. Absolutely. Okay, so then comes in languages. Okay, so if a service is always built on people, right? And the people are communicating. And when they communicate, they have to be using a language. So suddenly, what this is doing is it's elevating languages. The market value is rapidly rising in the Australian economy. If you can trade professional services, well, if you want to trade them internationally, you need the mechanism to do it, right? Language is a key to tap into the international market. So it's quite an interesting book, Linguanomics, talking about the way in which cross-linguistic and cross-cultural skills are not just a nice thing to have. It's not just about world peace, although that surely would be enough, right? It's not just about world peace, it's also about serious economic stuff as well. And I don't think this is yet understood in the wider world. But these cross-linguistic and cross-cultural skills are actually central to international trade and services, including professional services, including professional ones. And by professional ones, I mean in health, I mean in education, in those areas. I don't just mean service in the retail industry and so on. I don't mean just that. So employers, maybe they're picking up on it quicker than the politicians, I don't know. They're certainly picking up on it quicker than the folk leading universities and schools, I think. And this is really interesting. This was the Foundation for Young Australians. They did a survey of job ads, and they saw the top 5 skills that employers were looking for. Digital literacy, I think that's pretty obvious. I think that's a definite one that we all need to develop. But the second one, which had seen the largest increase, was calls for bilinguals, people with other language skills. So this is in the job ads, right? This is what actually employers are looking for. And then the normal sort of creativity, listening, team management. I like the listening and creativity together, right? Because I think listening means you do what you're told, which doesn't quite match with the creativity, but there you go, that's employers for you, right? Everyone wants everything. We want our cake and eat it too. And this is from the Apollo Research Institute. So there's a lot of talk about the future of work. And there's a lot of sort of scare campaigns. I don't know how many times I've read in the Courier Mail or whatever, our esteemed media, about the robots taking our jobs and automation. Okay, so it's a big thing, and it's true. It's not something that's going away, right? But they seem to be focusing on the wrong areas, and there also seems to be a panic and a sense of, what are we going to do, right? A bit of henny penny, and it doesn't seem to be a sense of, well, what do you need for future work skills? And in fact, it seems pretty obvious what they are, right? If you start thinking about it. Okay, so if we start trading in services, if languages and cultures are going to be at the center of this, right? So one of the key skills that you need is cross-cultural competency, along with the ability to virtually collaborate and so on, new media literacy, cognitive load management. Oh God, that's what we're all coping with at the moment, right? Having to have so many spinning plates, right? So these are all the sort of skills which are seen as essential in the future workforce. So I think that's important to see. The cross-cultural competency, linguistic skills are part of the future workforce. It's not just something backward-looking. It's not something traditional. It's actually something very forward-looking. So there's a value proposition not only for individual students in terms of getting a job, which is something that people talk about, or maybe more than just getting a job, having a career, right? The second thing is the value proposition for Australian society. So this is the Australian Council of Learned Academies, which is possibly a bunch of, I don't know, I have this image of, you know, people with long beards and, you know, slightly thick glasses and so on. I'm sure there's other people there as well. But what they came up with is this statement, which is, if we want to nurture wide-ranging, long-term, deep and mutually beneficial relations, it needs to be based on a principle of reciprocity, right? We have to reciprocate. And reciprocation is central to cooperation and trust. So, central to building trust is relationships, yeah? If you're going to have trust, you build a relationship. There's no trust without a relationship. We know that if you're going to have a relationship, communication's pretty central. We know what happens when you have a relationship, when you stop talking to the person. It's really not going well. And of course, central to communication is language. So what we see is if we're going to have cooperation and trust, it goes all the way back to language. But also the notion of reciprocating, right? It's not enough to be speaking with Chinese businessmen in English all the time. It's not a relationship of trust when you only use one language. And I think if you've used other languages, you know what I mean. It's just different. And also, of course, it's worth bearing in mind, this fact seems to surprise people a lot, that Chinese people actually like speaking Chinese. Wow, that's a surprise. Germans actually quite like speaking German. There's all sorts of transnational people. You know, the boxes are really complex. However, you know, if you're Japanese, I think Japanese quite like speaking Japanese. They'll speak English if they have to. But if you're trying to build a close, trusting relationship, reciprocating in the languages which you know is really central to that. And that's at the national level. Okay, so machine translation. Okay, it's really interesting. So this is for the language teachers, you know. It's machine translation, these little innocuous buds we put in our ears, or is it the Terminator coming to get us all? I think not. So I don't think it's the latter. It just complicates our work, but it also makes it interesting, and it means the audience we're speaking to, it goes from, I don't know, the 12% who do 12% who do languages in year 12 to 100% of the students. Everyone has to know this stuff. It changes everything. I don't think people have quite clicked how it's changing everything. And the reason it's changing everything is because you can just pick it up and you can mindlessly communicate with anyone in any sort of language. It's a limited form of communication if you've tried it, right? So I'll show you some examples. But nevertheless, you can do it. You can actually communicate with people of a sort. But the point is, if you can do that, you have to know what it is you're doing, right? No one would suggest you give a bunch of 5-year-olds calculators and go, okay, go off and do maths and flourish in the world, right? We have a whole curriculum which enables them to use such devices. So it's the same with the device that's been given to us. Now, okay. So one of the things that's changed in sort of translation world, machine translation, is the use of, they call it AI, but AI is being used pretty loosely there. The difference is it's what's called artificial neural networks. And more or less what that means is they train these softwares on data sets, and they learn through training in the data set. So it's different. Before, what they tried to do in machine translation is set up a bunch of rules. And rules plus probabilities. Yeah, it's essentially how they did it. And I don't know, 80% success, 90% success, depending on who you were talking to. More recently, they've started using a different kind of fundamentally different way of approaching the problem. So essentially what it means, the more data you have to throw at it, the better it'll be at doing it. So if you look at Google Translate, it's reasonably okay with major languages. It's pretty crappy for some of the less significant languages. And it depends what it is you put in there, right? If you put in really complex academic prose, you'll just get nonsense out, right? And the reason you get that out is one, because it's very complex sentences, and two, because there's not enough data. So they don't have enough bilingual data, basically, to be trained on. A second thing that's really improved, I'm sure you remember those times when that first came out, speech recognition. Yeah? This is Telstra, yes, no. You know, when you had to speak like this to get anything done, and then they'd go, I didn't quite catch that, could you say it again? It doesn't happen so much now, right? It's a lot better. You don't have to use your robot voice quite so much with speech recognition. So it's definitely getting better. And you can say something like, do you want to go to a movie? And the speech recognition can pick it up. You don't have to say, do you want to go to the movie? Yeah? You can use elision as you normally would. Actually, one of them, I was testing it out as you do, trying to use not really bad language, but slightly bad language. And it's really funny, it came up with little asterisks, wouldn't write up. I guess that's the kiddie safe thing. But in any case, speech recognition, text-to-speech synthesis, and it doesn't sound half bad when they come out with a speech. It's not quite so robotic-like anymore. It's not completely natural. There was a recent test. This is really interesting. People were freaking out about it. They have these AIs, not the AIs, the assistants, yeah?
Yeah, Google Assistant.
Google Assistant.
At the restaurant.
And people didn't realize it was a robot calling them up.
Yeah, freaked out.
That's getting freaky, right? We can't tell anymore. But, you know, I think if you started to have a conversation, you could tell pretty quickly. But, you know, if you're ordering at a restaurant, you're gonna whatever, it's getting easier and easier to do it, right? So it does mean if you're a traveler around the world, one of the things you can do is just, you know, use the device. Say, oh, I'd like this and this. And you can get it back. Different levels of resistance about it and so on. Okay, so it certainly can be used for travel and basic business transactions. I've heard of people buying a house in Brisbane using such devices. Yeah. I don't think they got a very good price.
In the state high catchment area, they're all good.
Okay, so in studies of it, basically the conclusion thus far is that something like Google Translate or iTranslate, there's various ones, they provide people with a quick translation. You can acquire information, and they're pretty good at translating individual words and phrases, and not too bad at global cohesion, but they really struggle with complex sentences at the moment. So yeah, academic prose is definitely out for the time being. So if we have a look at an example, this is thought I'd better introduce it quickly, although it's probably a little out of date. This is Mao Zedong's great thoughts. Really should be Xi Jinping now, of course. But we're comparing, this is the Google Translate versus the human translation. And it's sort of interesting just to compare them. Clearly there's problems with this one, right? But the interesting thing is you can get the idea. I'll keep quiet and let you read it. That's not bad. You can get the idea. I mean, obviously we like the human one, right? And the thing you would say is professional translators in our school who are teaching, they use Google Translate to give them a rough translation. Why not? It's there. It gives you the guts of it, and then you go in and edit it, right? So certainly some kinds of translation you can't do. People would argue poetry and literary translation would be very difficult to accomplish, if ever, in this way. But a lot of stuff isn't poetry and so on. It can be done in this sort of way. So I thought it's worth exploring some kind of more basic communication. So this was spitting it out. If I was brave, I'd do it here. I was thinking to try and get a pair, but I didn't get organized. So I thought I'd just do it. But basically, this was creating conversation. You know, if you want to see a movie, and this is what it came out with. It sounded quite nice. あなたは映画を見たいですか? What's interesting about the things that come out here is they're stuck on the English syntax, right? So I don't think people would say あなたは. Doesn't sound very good in Japanese. Drop it, just drop those pronouns. We don't want them. So certain things come up, and hello, my name is Michael. I don't know, it doesn't sound very natural. Konnichiwa, watashi no namae wa Michael desu. It sounds like the kind of thing that a first-year learner would produce, right? I've got these words and I put them in order, and that's what I get. So this kind of device is more or less like your first-year learner translator. Yep. However, you get the idea. It's unnatural. However, you can hold a sort of a conversation in this way. And then I was trying out the Chinese as well in both directions. I didn't do all the Chinese bits because some of them I didn't pronounce well. I came out with some funny things. So that's a danger, right? But anyway, again, it seems to come up with, you know, do you want to go and see a movie? So I'm imagining I'm talking to this person, right? We don't have a lingua franca anymore. I speak English, you speak Chinese, we don't speak each other's languages. Okay, let's see what happens. Do you want to go and see a movie? 你想去看电影吗? And then I tried to be the person responding, 我不想去看. I'm not going to go look. Because of course you can drop the movie. You don't have to say, I'm not going to go and see the movie. You just go, I'm not going to go and look. That's natural in Chinese. So it seems to have trouble with either putting in things that are in the original language which you don't need, or not putting in things when you do need them, right? It seems to have trouble. It doesn't know about ellipsis and dropping and that kind of thing. No surprise. However, I suppose it's not too bad, right? I'm not going to go look. Okay, I think I get the idea. You don't want to go and see it. I don't want to see. Why? Because I don't want to see. Yeah? This is the answers I get back, speaking with my hypothetical Chinese person who can't speak in English. So, unnatural. Yeah? It's not good English. It's not good Chinese. But it's okay. You can certainly understand each other. It's interesting. So what's the problem here, right? There's many levels of the problem, but basically the problem is that any translation, machine translation, only works on syntactic form. But of course, when we're translating, we're thinking in terms of meaning. But meaning is generated through thinking about what people mean, right? Thinking about their intentions and so on. A computer can't read people's intentions yet. And that's not how it works. It works on form. So this is the big danger, basically. What it provides is useful input. And so when you're trying to explain why is Google Translate not good, why can't it do everything? Because it doesn't translate meaning. It only translates forms. That's useful, but it's like a calculator. It's just a tool. You can't be a mathematician with a calculator. You have to know what it is you're putting in and what comes out, and then what do you do with it, right? It's the same with Google Translate. You put it in, you know what comes out. It's not the final answer, actually. So it's the meaning form thing. So that gives you a clue as to what these kind of things could be useful for. I think this is a great example of why speaker meaning is really important. Donald Trump, he's wonderful. God bless him, right? He was quoted as saying the Germans are bad, very bad. Now, the interesting thing about this statement, it's really simple, right? I mean, it's hard to think of a more basic statement you could make. Germans, bad, right? It's really simple. How could there be any trouble with translating this? Well, anyway, so the interesting thing is, and this is an interesting thing, right? When you use really basic words, actually it can mean all sorts of things. That's the beauty of it. This is the beauty of Trump's speech. Yeah, it's clever. in a sense. In a sense. So here we've got two different German words. I don't speak German. Anyone speak German?
Yes.
Can you oblige?
What do you want?
Oh, I just want you to read these two.
Böse, schlecht.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Misspelled schlecht.
Oh, did I? Sorry.
I stated correctly.
Difference in meaning?
No,
Or
that's non-existent.
Böse is more
H is
naughty.
missing, that's all.
Oh, did I miss the
But
H? Wow.
is the meaning different between the two?
Böse
Oh,
is
yeah,
more,
yeah,
when you
yeah.
say kid, child is böse, it means more naughty. It's naughty
Böse? I thought that was
in the sense of naughty, böse.
So what's happening right now is exactly what happened in the German media. What did he mean? What did he mean by this? Is he saying we're this? I'm not going to try and pronounce it. Are we this or this? Is this what Trump's saying? What does he mean? Big debate. So, according to some German speakers, this one's kind of more on the evil side, and this one's not quite as bad. So this is bad. This is just bad. Yeah. So what can you do with a statement like the Germans are bad, very bad, right? So the point being that words don't match up, right? So if you've got one word in English and two different that you can choose from in German, which one are you going to pick? And how does Google Translate decide? How? So the only way it can decide is through probabilities, right? Whatever is more frequently used. And often that turns out to be the right answer, but not necessarily so, of course, because people have intentions, and the translation doesn't read the intentions. Of course, another thing is cultural routines. So we use language in different ways to do different things, right? So this is a really classic one in Chinese. It's similar in sort of other cultures, interestingly enough, in Arabic cultures and so on. This idea that if someone invites you, you should refuse first. And you refuse first to show that you're not greedy, and the person re-invites you to show that they were actually really sincere. And I tell you, in the family, there's trouble. I've seen it. One family member will ask the other family member, do you want to stay for dinner? And they go, oh, no. And then they don't repeat the invitation, and then the person gets really upset. It's really true. So there's back and forth. Okay, we decided you're going to stay for dinner. And of course, I've experienced this routine, going to friends' places, Chiong, have something to eat, and the classic one which I suppose you learn as a learner, which is 不用了, 谢谢. Okay, no, thank you. However, that never really works, and they always just keep giving it to you, right? So you actually have to come up with something else as well. So the magic, if you're ever with a Chinese person, what you should say is 我自己来, meaning I'll help myself. Yeah? And that's the way to stop it happening. Just if you want to know. And of course it goes back the other way. This happened to me. Had a friend over, do you want some tea or coffee? And they said, no, thank you. And so I didn't offer them anything. And then later on they complained to me, why don't you give me anything to drink? She said no. So anyway. Google Translate is not going to be able to get us out of this mess. Okay, so there's rapidly increasing imperative to gain this kind of cross-linguistic awareness and cross-cultural competence, which is driven, and it's kind of a paradox, by these globalizing forces, right? So the more we're together, the more we have to actually learn other languages and understand how to negotiate through other languages, through other cultures. That's really important. We really need this basic linguistic understanding that words don't match up. It's not just like a dictionary where you go from one to the other. And the way people do things with language, it changes, right? And whatever people mean by it isn't always transparent in the words they use. But there are routines. There are ways of figuring it out. However, you need to be aware that it's more than just form. Okay, implications for language education. This is probably more of a discussion point. Jui Lingo, where that picture came from. Don't know who that is. But anyway, this is the one that crass people in senior management in the university like to show us. Look at that, Duolingo. Don't need you guys anymore. So it's a freemium. I've never heard of that term before, but freemium means it's free, but if you want better stuff, you have to pay for it. So they kind of hook you in and then you pay for the extras, right? So it's a language learning platform. They have apps and everything. It's quite a big thing now. Spanish, 126 million learners around the world. French, 74 million. German, 45 million. Italian, 25 million. It's big numbers. Interestingly, it seems to be, it came out of the US, right? So the languages which are popular are driven by the interests of US speakers, right? So Spanish, French, German, Italian, and so on. Japanese is way down the list and Chinese way down the list. It may be something to do with when these languages are offered as well. So Spanish would have been the first one. So there's timing issues as well. And Indonesian to be released. Busu, it's funny. It's got a meaning in, anyway. In different languages, right? So as I said it aloud, I just realized. So there's 12 languages there that they're offering. Okay, so it seems, again, we can use these kind of things. And I mean, it's nice to see people interested. My father's actually learning French using this thing. Never thought to do it before, right? So the idea of trooping down to a community centre and doing it seems a bit hard. He can just do it from his computer. He's going to France, he's having a go. So it's kind of exciting, I think, in some ways. But what the experts say is, what do you get from these kind of websites? Well, not surprisingly, you get this kind of focus on form. And what you find with all the language learning apps, particularly that people are running around with, you get a kind of yes or no. And that's pretty obvious, because when I try to speak in Chinese to test whether my pronunciation is any good, well, it's really clear if I'm not pronouncing it right, because the computer can't, the translator can't understand it. So that's feedback. Oh, said it wrong. But it's not telling me how I should say it, it's just telling me I'm saying it wrong. Yeah. And so what it gives you is an environment in which to make mistakes. So you can make mistakes and you get feedback on mistakes, which is funny because learners, sort of naive learners, always want to be corrected. I always remember being in Japan and you're teaching English there, and students would always say to me, please correct my English, right? I'm sure you know that, Amanda. If you've taught in Japan, students always ask you to correct their English. Obsessed with being corrected, right? It's as we know, that's not really the best way to learn a language, right? Just through error correction. However, it's good for students to have the chance to make mistakes, to build up their confidence in an environment where if they make mistakes, they just laugh to themselves, right? They don't have the threat of people listening.
Yeah, Japanese will never correct you Japanese.
Oh, well, yeah, there's that too, right? Yeah, that's true. It's not fair. Always asking us to correct their bloody English. There's no reciprocation. Okay, but what apps can't do is they can't address cross-linguistic, cross-cultural competencies. They can't get to this level. There's just no way to get to that. Because when you're dealing with these kind of things, you're talking about meaning, right? And apps are focused on form. So they're useful for form, not so much for meaning. Okay, so recent developments, they're changing the landscape in which we teach and learn languages. And I've seen there's, it's a very new thing. There's not that much research into how people are bringing, there's been sort of technology in the classroom for a while, but how do we actually bring translation devices? How do we bring these apps into the classroom? What does it mean in the language classroom? Do we just kick them out and say, no, you shall not use those things? It's like the weight of the calculator, right? Eventually in maths, you just have to start using it. So language apps are probably kind of like that. If they're at the level you feel it gives you something and they're useful, right? So it is changing the landscape, and it's changing the type of learners we have and the way in which they come to us to learn languages. But of course, we have to remember that apps and so on, it's not real communication ultimately. It's about real communication with real people. Okay, so that's where I wanted to leave it. So I don't know if you had any questions or discussions or thoughts that you wanted to raise.
So you're saying that students using Google Translate, that's all right? I think it's okay, but there's a lot of things
I'm being recorded, right?
I suppose.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think an individual teacher has to make her own decision, right? I would respect a professional to make their decision. So I think that's fine. However, I think the weight of technological change, it's something that's hard to hold back because students just have them, right? Certainly you can't stop at a university. We can't stop students bringing in, I mean, I guess in schools you can stop students, right?
Try. You wouldn't touch them. You wouldn't touch their devices.
Yeah. So you can't touch them. So you could try, but I mean, at university, there's no way. They just bring them in, right?
And one thing is definitely we have to aware of is that it's actually replaced dictionaries. Students no longer use dictionaries. They just Google things and try to find out. So the concept of dictionary as a support of language learning fundamentally changed. And I don't think they use the English thesaurus, so that kind of, they just go to see how it goes kind of thing. So we really have to accept the way students learn, but also we have to train them in differently how they actually be able to use, not just to cheat, I think that's, we have to learn and we have to change our way of teaching as well.
It's the same thing as using a dictionary. Look up the word, oh yeah, that's a translation. Oh, hang on, you chose a noun instead of a verb. One thing I've noticed is at the school I'm at, so the younger kids have got iPads. So the teacher's letting them find things, and if they have to supervise on one to say, well, here's the structure you need. Oh no, I'd much rather go Google Translate and get it wrong. And the kids I had, even sort of today, he can play football. Looked up can, put in can, what? Tin can. But then there's the opportunity to explain sort of, you've got to know what you're looking for. You were saying before about knowing how to manipulate what to do with the language. Same thing with dictionary as with your translation device. You've got to know what you're looking for. So you've got to know something about how language works.
And looking at frequency too as well is quite interesting. I think it's Weblio or Weblio or something where it looks at the usage of the words on the internet, and I think that's another thing to look at. So being critical, looking at frequency of usage and such. We can go on and on.
Yes.
I had what I thought was interesting is the bringing up the point about employability. And I think that's interesting that, and I'm sure that someone out there is doing this, but bringing that in as a reason why we should focus more on language learning. And I know you were bringing that in and that was a part of it, but I'm just wondering at the policy level, is that being used as clearly as an argument for why we should be focusing on languages more?
I was at something yesterday, the Creativity Summit run by Griffith University. Was talking about initial teacher education, and it actually referred to that study, the youth, whatever. And their interpretation of bilingual skills was it's okay we speak English. I just want to cry, So even within a reasonably well-educated room, it was putting a particular skew on it. So there's a lot of work for us still to do in terms of ensuring our colleagues understand what it means to be plurilingual.
Right.
I think part of the problem is it's a kind of a fear, and it's also just experience, right? So if you're a reasonably successful professional in Australia at the moment, you didn't need to speak languages, right? That's your experience. You didn't. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not going to be the future of your children. Whatever your lived experience of your career has been, it's not going to be the same. That is just a certainty. So I think it's very natural for us to project whatever our experience has been onto future generations. Well, if it's been like that for me, it'll be fine, right? But I think it's not going to be fine. And so being a monolingual in a plurilingual world will start to become more and more a disadvantage, right? It really will.
Well, my son, he is now looking at positions that he could potentially apply for. And one of the positions, it was clearly stated that diversity was important to that position, and that if you spoke another language, if you come from another culture, then you get like points, and that is attributed to, like, I guess, your employability.
Yeah.
So I just thought so it is down at the ground level, it's there, and it just doesn't seem to be clear to the policymakers that that's there. I don't know, because I didn't see that connection between that. Yeah.